Hello, Emergence. Great to be with you guys today as we continue in our devotions through the book of Ecclesiastes. Today we're going to be in chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. And the author of the book talks today a lot about wisdom and specifically how wisdom works itself out in submission to authority. In this case, the author's speaking of submission to the king. And in those times when this book was written, the kings had unlimited power. And oftentimes, as verse 9 shows, they abused that power with the people. So it took great discernment and great wisdom in being able to address the king. So the question is, why do we submit to authority or government authorities? And the answer comes in verse 2 of this chapter. It says, "Keep the king's commands because God's oath to him." Now, it is God who put the rulers or those in power there, and it's our job, as a general rule, to submit to them and to follow them. Just take the words of Paul from Romans 13. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." As we consider this time, when it's political agendas are heightened, either through the COVID crisis or the fact that the elections are a couple months away, we need, as Christians, to show great wisdom and great maturity in how we handle these things. How are we going to handle ourselves if the nominee that we don't choose gets elected? Will we be able to pray for them and fall under that authority, or are we going to try to tear them down and wish for their destruction? That doesn't mean that we can't have strong political opinions, right? We definitely can. The thing to consider is how and when do we share those convictions, right? What we don't want is to elevate our political positions to the level of the gospel, right? We don't want to alienate people within the church, and most definitely we don't want to create some sort of stumbling block for people hearing the gospel, as if they somehow need to align with some political party to know Christ and follow Christ. So it just takes great wisdom as we approach these things and how we handle them and how we handle our discussions in this area. And I think there's a broader way to look at submission to authority, not just through government lens, but also in our daily lives, right? For example, those of us that have bosses and jobs, right? And we submit to the authority of our boss, and sometimes we may not like them, or we may not like their strategies, but can we still work hard and do the job we're being asked, or are we going to gossip with other coworkers or possibly undermine our authority? Now, does that mean that we can never speak our minds or give advice or give our thoughts to someone in authority? No, I think in verse 5 and 6 in this chapter it says, "The wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. There's a time and a way for everything," right? So it just takes great thought and discernment on when and where and how we address those in authority. We need to make sure that our heart is in the right place, that we truly are there for their good and for the good of the organization. We also just need to count the cost, right? If we do come and say something in opposition to someone in charge, what are the potential consequences, and are we able to live with those? And finally, is there ever a time to outright reject government authority or authority in general? And I think the answer is very, very clear throughout scriptures. The answer is yes. And when can we do that? When we're called to do by an earthly authority asks us to reject or turn away from one of God's commandments or God's commands. Just think about a couple examples. One being the apostles as they're imprisoned, and when they were coming out, they were told, don't do not preach about Jesus or the resurrection again. And what did they say? What did Peter say? He said, no, we're not going to stop doing that. We must follow God, not men. And then take a couple of examples from the book of Daniel. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refuse to worship idols, and they're thrown into a furnace. Or Daniel himself, who refuses to stop praying to his God, and is thrown to the lions. These are all examples of men standing up for their faith, but at the same time, there was a risk, right? There's a risk of imprisonment, there's a risk of execution, and they were willing to do that to follow Christ. In our culture, we live in a culture where we have religious freedoms, but we have to remember and be praying for those brothers and sisters around the world that are currently in oppression and are risking their lives, risking their freedom to follow Christ, right? There's brothers and sisters around the world that are currently imprisoned for their faith. There are brothers and sisters that are being executed and killed on a regular basis throughout the world. So I guess ultimately the question is, why does God teach us about submission to authority? And why is there wisdom in that? To earthly authority, especially, that is flawed and sinful. And I think the answer is found earlier in Ecclesiastes and throughout Scripture, but it's one of the key themes, I think, in Ecclesiastes, and it comes from Ecclesiastes 3:11. I think it sums it up pretty well here. It says, "He has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end." So basically, God has put in our heart to have knowledge, to know Him, and to know about Him. But the reality is that this side of heaven, we're never going to know God in all His ways fully. We're not going to understand what He's called us to, or we're not going to understand all His plans. And yet we're still called to follow Him, right? Jesus is our true King, right? That deserves our devotion. And we need to follow Him even when we don't understand. I'm going to leave you with the words of Jesus when it comes to wisdom. Here it is. "Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock." So what he's saying, wisdom is not in the knowing, it's in the doing. I pray that you guys have a great day today, and as you reflect and think through what it means to submit to Christ, to follow Him even when we don't fully understand. Have a great day, guys.